Hi, welcome to the Times Visuals Daily Briefing. It is Monday, March 16th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg, and I'm speaking today with my colleague, political correspondent Ariela Karmel. Ariela, how are you doing?
I'm still here, Jess.
I am
We'll see
very, very
tomorrow.
happy. Right. Yeah, so listeners, it is it's after 10:30 a.m. Ariela, who's in Tel Aviv, I'm in Jerusalem. She just got out of the shelter. In our latest reports, there were just 2 impacts from the suspected Iranian cluster bomb in central Israel. No injuries reported, and we're hoping there will be no injuries reported from that and from any others in the rest of the day. In other headlines, the IDF is beginning its targeted ground operation in South Lebanon to expand the buffer zone against Hezbollah, which has been targeting and really pummeling Israel's north, certainly pretty much every single night and throughout the day. We'll talk about what that means for the north right now in terms of budgets, in terms of the Knesset. Ariela will take us into that. We'll also look at what has just been happening in the Knesset right now, given this period of basically closure across Israel. By the way, today is the day that some parts of Israel that have not really been targeted in strikes, where some zones, kids have been allowed to go back to school, very limited. That's one of the other headlines. But then going back to what Ariela will speak about, like I said, Knesset, what's happening in the north, and the significant lack of shelter for the Bedouin. All of that after a moment. Stay with us. Okay, so Ariela, let's talk about, it's Monday, which is kind of Knesset day in a sense, a lot of committee meetings usually. And we spoke a little bit about this yesterday. What's happening in the Knesset right now, given the fact that the Israeli economy is closed but open in some senses, and what does that actually mean for the Knesset, for the parliament?
So the Knesset, starting this week, has returned to not full activity. It's still reduced, but far more normal activity than the first 2 weeks of the war, where most Knesset activity was essentially halted unless it was related to votes or discussions that were specifically relevant to the war or to passing the budget, which must be passed by the end of March officially. So if not, it's really crucial. It will trigger the collapse of the government and lead to early elections in June. Right now, elections are set for October, but if the budget is unable to pass, it will be much earlier. So until this week, that was really the only order of business going on in the Knesset, and again, anything related to the ongoing war. But as of Thursday, the Knesset Speaker, Amir Ohana, decided to increase the amount of activity at the Knesset. And so this has been a source of a lot of controversy and opposition from parties within the political opposition who have said, we're in the middle of this massive war where the entire country, almost to a man, is running to bomb shelters, frequently evading Iranian ballistic missiles. Why are we talking about anything else at this point in time? Especially because the Knesset is not open to most of the public at this point. It's still very restricted due to the war restrictions on gatherings. So I'm not physically present because journalists are restricted at this point in time from attending committee sessions. So I'm following remotely. And there's a huge swath of legislation that has returned to the agenda that is not related to the war, not related to the budget, and a lot of controversial legislation, including a politically appointed probe into the October 7th massacres, which is largely opposed by bereaved families and hostages and their families, a bill to split the role of the Attorney General, a broadcast overhaul bill, a media overhaul bill by Communications Minister Shlomo Kari, and a death penalty bill for terrorists. So there's a lot of activity, and we'll see how it develops this week. Like I said, the main focus is on the budget, but we can expect there to be many votes, I think, in the plenum. If not this week, then next week, certainly, on some of this other legislation.
So going back to your last sentence, there will be votes in the plenum this week. in the plenum where the Knesset members speak, where they sit?
It's scheduled. It's on the agenda. The plenum is supposed to be meeting today. There are also faction meetings, which all of the parties hold typically every Monday and are open to the press. So those are starting today. They weren't held last week. There were no plenum sessions, but they're expected to be this week, barring some unexpected event.
Okay, got it. Okay, let's move to two particular pieces that you published recently. One about Northerners, Northern Israel, like I said earlier in the headlines, pummeled by missiles from Hezbollah. I happen to have written a piece about it this week from the agricultural perspective. These are people who live literally on the border, or their avocado groves and apple orchards, etc., are right on the border with Lebanon. And many of these communities were evacuated on October 9th, 2023, when Hezbollah started its missile strikes then. And they've returned there in the last year or so. And now they're basically experiencing the same thing again. And for instance, one avocado farmer said to me that in his community, in Mizgav Am, many houses don't even have mamads, do not have safe rooms. They run to shelters just like you are in Tel Aviv, even though they are literally pummeled throughout the day. Even though the government had said to them after October 9th, 2023, we will build safe rooms for you. And now, 2.5 years later, that still hasn't happened. So tell me what the conversation is in the Knesset right now between representatives of the North and what's happening with those kinds of budget allocations.
So also last week, the government, Prime Minister Netanyahu and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich announced that they were instituting a 3% cut across the entire budget that would affect all ministries in order to bolster the defense budget amid the ongoing war. And this accounts for approximately 150 million shekels, which is not a small amount. And part of the controversy, there are two aspects to this that have been criticized. One is that they simultaneously approved the dispersal of a huge amount of coalition funds while instituting this cut across various ministries. So what that means is essentially the entire budget and the entire state is receiving a cut, except for coalition initiatives. And that accounts for approximately 5 billion shekels that has now been dispersed to coalition funds, primarily for yeshivot, for Haredi schools, for West Bank settlements. Areas that, whatever you may think of whether they're deserving of those funds or should be receiving those funds, the fact that they are receiving such an inordinate amount of money in the middle of this war, when every other ministry in the government is being cut, has been a source of major controversy, especially because, going to your question, one of the main areas that has been cut that isn't immediately visible are resources that have been earmarked across various ministries that are embedded in the education ministry, in the health ministry fund, in the Ministry of the Interior, for the rehabilitation of northern communities, and specifically northern communities along the confrontation line bordering Lebanon, who have been, as you've said, one of the worst epicenters of not only this current war, but for almost the last 3 years, since October 7th, and have still not recovered from the bombardment of Hezbollah for nearly 2 years, and have not received so many of the funds that were allocated to them and that were approved by this government. And so now, on top of that, they are also losing about 150 million shekels because of this cut. And it's been hotly contested, not only by these communities themselves, who wrote letters to the Knesset, to the Prime Minister directly, to Bezalel Smotrich, the Finance Minister, but also from within the coalition itself. About 9 coalition lawmakers, also opposition lawmakers, it was a bipartisan letter, but spearheaded by coalition lawmakers, wrote a letter to Bezalel Smotrich saying that this is not acceptable, that at a time of war when these communities are being pummeled, among the worst being pummeled and affected, and have still not received the funds that they were supposed to receive from the previous bombardment, are now forced to suffer a cut. It's not acceptable. So there hasn't been any development on this front in terms of if the government will reverse course and exempt these communities from that funding cut. But it's been a huge source of consternation across the board politically.
Is it under discussion today at all, do you know, or in any way, shape, or form?
Yes. So it's going to be discussed in the Knesset today, I believe on the Economics Committee, but I need to verify that. But it's definitely on the agenda. As I said, it's received enormous bipartisan support to discuss the cuts and to exempt northern communities. I did want to add just another thing, but just when you were talking about how you've met people in the north who themselves don't have shelters, even though they are on the front lines of Hezbollah missiles and Iranian missiles. There was a report, and this relates to my coverage on the Bedouin communities as well, presented by the state controller in January, before the war started, but it's been republished by the Knesset Center for Research and Information since the war started, about how so much of the country is lacking bomb shelters. The entire country, across the board, there's an enormous shortage of bomb shelters, and this was known and discussed, and subsequent reports were released by the state controller's office prior to the last Iranian war since October 7th, and then particularly since June, since the last war with Iran, that there was a severe shortage of bomb shelters, particularly in southern communities, the Bedouin, which we'll discuss later, but also northern communities, because there was a huge funding program to rehabilitate the north that was actually started before October 7th. It started in 2018, and it was supposed to be a 5-year plan to inject billions of shekels into the north to revive it, because it was already suffering economically and in various respects, all of which have been exacerbated since October 7th and since this last war. And this report found that plan was frozen, and that the Home Front Command had actually frozen plans, including to build new bomb shelters, which are desperately needed in northern communities because they had not received the allocated funds from the government. So this was already an issue before this most recent spending cut. So it's really just, I think, the straw that broke the camel's back for so many people, and that's why you're seeing opposition from within the coalition itself, because this is just the latest failure to support these communities.
Got it. Thanks for adding that, Ariela. Okay, let's go to a quick break. When we're back, let's basically continue this conversation about shelters, but in the Bedouin community in the South. So stay with us. One of the pieces you also wrote in the last couple of days was about the Bedouin in the South, who many of them live in unrecognized villages and build without proper zoning, and as well do not have any kind of shelter, forget bomb shelters or safe rooms. I mean, you describe it in your story, the kinds of shelter they are seeking when there is an incoming missile. So I'd actually first like to hear about what brought you to cover the Bedouin. Was it because of the Knesset? What brought you to decide this is something I want to report on this week?
So I reported on this issue during the last war in June. And I actually visited a couple of Bedouin communities, including the village of Abu Talul, which is actually a recognized village, which we'll get into what the distinction is between recognized and unrecognized. And so this is something that I've been concerned about and interested in and covering for a while. It's a known issue. It predates October 7th. It has to do with the conflict between the state and these communities in terms of recognizing them and granting them resources and protection from the state, not just relating to shelter from Iranian missiles, but also water, electricity. And in the last war, all of this was really brought to a forefront. We saw images, like we have again now, of Bedouin children and Bedouin communities hiding in cement pipes or in holes in the ground because they have no shelters at all in their communities. And a report was published in January by an organization called the Negev Coexistence Forum, which advocates for these communities and does work in the area, that found that about 2/3 of Bedouin have no access to any shelter at all. So that includes in-home shelter or public shelters. Most people in these communities don't have in-home shelters.
What does access to shelter even mean? What does that even look like if they do have access? Yeah, what does it actually look like for them?
So it means that they have what the rest of Israeli society would not consider acceptable shelters. There are a couple of shelters that you'll see in these communities, and you also see them in the north, by the way. There are miguniyot, which are portable shelters that are above ground. They're cement structures. They're very basic structures.
The kind that we saw of October 7th in the Gaza
Exactly.
envelope. Right.
Yes.
Field shelters.
Yes. You see them in the south and the north a lot. And they're not, I think I spoke to some residents who said that just to have one it adds some comfort. But the reality is that certainly under an Iranian ballistic missile, if there's a direct hit, it has absolutely no help whatsoever. And these are the better options. There are these other shelters called HESCO shelters, which are roofless, and they're very, very simple, some reinforced cement structures that are essentially useless, again, in terms of protection. So since the last war with Iran, the government put about 160
field shelters.
Portable shelters, and I think about 74 HESCOs in Bedouin communities, because right now there are 6 public shelters for the entire Bedouin community in the Negev. In major Bedouin towns where there's no shelter of all, or the closest shelter is in a town further away, it's one public shelter.
Which you're not going to make in a minute and a half.
No one goes to. They just sit at home. They have approximately one public shelter for every 53,000 Bedouin, for every 53,000 people. I'll give you an example. In the town of Rahat, which is the biggest Bedouin town, there's approximately 70,000 people living there. 5 of the 6 shelters for the entire Bedouin population in the Negev are in Rahat. And whereas neighboring Ofakim is a population of approximately 41,000, half the size of Rahat, they have 150 public shelters. So there's a massive disparity in terms of the shelters that are available for Jewish towns in the area and Negev and Bedouin towns, including ones that are recognized, by the way, which Rahat is. And that's one of the issues that you see when you go there, is that the conditions are almost indistinguishable between quote-unquote unrecognized villages and many recognized ones. So I spoke to a man, his name's Atiya al-Salam, who's the head of the the Council for Unrecognized Bedouin Villages, which is kind of an unofficial council that advocates for them. He's from Abu Talul, which is a recognized village. It's been recognized for 20 years. It looks the same as unrecognized villages. Most people also, by the way, the homes that people are living in, they're tin structures for the most part.
Right.
Well, they're tin structures primarily. These are not like concrete and cement homes. They're very small, very modest, very basic. They're not connected to the most part to water or electricity. And so what these communities rely on, like Atia told me, is usually schools will have some kind of shelter. But again, there is a massive, massive shortage across the country, by the way, in terms of shelters and schools, but it's all the more pronounced within these villages. And so even if a school has a shelter, it can accommodate maybe 10 people. And again, it's not a mamad by our definition. It's not at all. So most people will just stay at home. And they also don't have in these communities, often, they don't have the Iron Dome. There's no Iron Dome protection because they're not recognized by the state. So
the Iron Dome isn't operating in their region.
Well, the Iron Dome recognizes the area as uninhabited, so it'll just let a missile fall because that's often how the Iron Dome will function. If it's not a populated area, it's not going to waste an interceptor on it. So that's how they're recognized, even though these are, of course, populated areas. So it's especially scary considering the fact that they have nowhere to run to, and they have no alarm even to warn them. But they will hear the alarms from surrounding Jewish areas.
And that's what prompts them to run if they can.
Yes, to a hole in the ground.
So, okay, now bring us back to your beat on this, which is the political. Is there any conversation going on about this right now? In other words, you wrote about this last week. Or late last week. Why?
I wrote about it last week because there is a conversation in the Knesset going on about the lack of shelters overall and the lack of shelters in the Negev and in northern communities. There isn't a focused discussion on the lack of shelters facing the Bedouin community or more broadly the Arab community within the country, which the numbers are also significantly lower if you look at Arab communities in the north in terms of their access to shelter. Arab parties, Hadash and Ram. Ram is Mansour Abbas's party, whose constituency primarily comes from Bedouin in the Negev, have discussed this a lot. And there may be discussions this week in committees to focus on, I think there is one to discuss the lack of shelters in the Negev. Specifically, there isn't a focused discussion on the disparity among the Arab population. However, the State Controller report, which kind of initiated this conversation because it was written before the war started, anticipating that there would be a new. Yes, it was published in January, and it was anticipating that we've all been waiting for this conflict to come. And so that was partly why it was published, and it kind of slid under the radar. And now that the war has started, and this has become such a pressing, obvious issue that the entire country is facing, it's generated new attention, and it is being discussed in the Knesset. But more broadly speaking, looking at the entire country in terms of the national shortage of shelters. But within that report, the state controller specifically discusses that everything that he is discussing is even worse within the Arab community in the country. And it was especially noted. And he also noted the fact that after October 7th, a task force was set up, kind of a multi-ministry task force, but that was officially under the Ministry for Social Equality, to focus on emergency preparedness and disseminating information about safety regulations for the Arab community. And the main focus was on the Bedouin of the Negev because that was where the greatest need was, but it was for the Arab community en masse. And it was shut down in 2024 by the Social Equality Minister, Mai Golan, without really any kind of explanation. The argument at the time was that there weren't enough budgets. The government wasn't giving enough funding for it. It was disputed. In this report, the state controller says that he criticizes that it was shut down and says that it's of immediate urgency that the prime minister's office, in alignment with other ministries, establish some kind of body to focus on this issue in particular, because it's a disaster, frankly.
Got it. Ariela, thanks for taking us through this. It's been helpful and enlightening to hear everything that you had to tell us today. So thanks.
My pleasure. I hope that one day I have something positive to report.
We'll get there. We are going to get there. I promise you. I don't know when yet, but we will get there. Thanks to all of you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode is produced by Ari Schlacht. As always, feel free to recommend us to other listeners. Rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Those of us who are in this region, please stay safe. Be careful, and have a good week. See you soon.
With rockets falling indiscriminately on Israel from both Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon, hospitals have moved underground. And in Tel Aviv's Ichilov hospital, the entire operation is now in a multi-level parking garage.
So this is, on a daily basis, an underground parking lot. But in emergency cases, basically this is emergency hospital. So the parking lot has the option to turn in 4 hours, and become the underground hospital for all the hospital.
Is there still an above hospital?
All the patients are underground. And when I talk about basically the whole hospital, I'm talking about the whole hospital. Oncology, pediatric, surgery wards. We have breast cancer patients that go mastectomy and reconstruction. All other oncological operations continue to go on. But we have to do the adjustments. And day by day, we're basically deciding which operations should continue, which operations should be delayed after the war.
What does it take to move a hospital in 4 hours from upstairs to downstairs?
We knew in advance, when the situation was escalating, so we did already some kind of preparation before that. We had lists of where the patients are going to go home, where the patients are going to go down. We put all the equipment that we knew that we needed and immediately. They were ready to basically get down to the to the underground. And once we got the okay, we call it a 0 hour that we need to go down, in 4 hours, and I'm talking about the whole hospital, came down in 4 hours, which is amazing. But remember two things. One, we were ready, and two, we had experience from the June 25.
Right,
that was the first,
war,
exactly. We were here also. And we had an enormous cooperation from the patients. Patients and the patient's family, helping us, bringing down the patients with all their belongings. It was like, a row of patients waiting to get down. It was really dramatic, I must say.
I feel like that is something that is so unique to Israel and often overlooked is the communal aspect of things. We saw it on October 7th. We saw it afterwards. When you guys were moving the hospital down, you even saw it come out there where people were actually moving things.
Till noon. Around noon, 12:30, the whole hospital was here. But like you say, it's something that is in the Israeli genes or genetics of working here in the Middle East, of really adapting, quick adapters, changing your thought process. This is emergency. We need to go down quickly to the -2, and this is what happened. It's really unheard of, and it's really something dramatic.
Have you noticed, or are you in contact with other hospitals in other regions, other countries that are currently in this conflict doing the same kind of thing? Is that widespread? Is that really uniquely, you think, to Israel itself?
It's very unique to Israel. I have my European friends, my American friends. They're like, how are you guys doing? How are you? They really don't understand the situation. Really something that is really big, that it's really hard to conceive or really hard to, basically talk to somebody abroad and explain to him what's going on. For my colleagues in other hospitals, it's same. So in Tel HaShomer, Bellinson, up north, down south, everybody's really, into it. So I think it's about the same concept. And when I'm thinking, that I want to be a doctor and taking care of patients, I don't think that this situation was my top 10 list. Thinking of me basically rolling down, a hospital bed to the -2 because there's missiles around. It wasn't in my DD, right, in my top list.
This wasn't what you trained for, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. I wasn't signed up for this, but at that moment, at 8 o'clock, this is what as the head of the department, the most important thing is to bring the patient to a secure place. This is what I didn't need to operate him at that time. I didn't need to give him something dramatic. I just need to bring him to a secure place. That was the most important thing to do, and this is what we done.
Are there changes, though, in how you go about dealing with patients and protocol and things? For example, when you refer to a room in a hospital, it might be room 303. Here is it parking spot 303, as in...
So already this parking lot was built in a, future thinking that this is going to be the emergency hospital. So everything here, and also you can see by the beds, there's an opening of a place for electricity, for all, machines that we need to work, oxygen, and all other things that we need to take care of the patients. So the thought is already futuristic thought that this is going to happen and we're going to be here.
Do you guys charge by the bed or by the parking spot now? How does that work?
Parking spot in Tel Aviv is very expensive. So I think it's a good idea.
Thank you again. Really.